Hi everyone, to the first lecture of Introduction to Economics. I will be teaching this course this semester, and I hope that you are all doing safe and healthy. And I really hope that you enjoy this course as we cover more and more topics. Uh, let's have an overview of what we are going to cover today in this introductory course. First, I will introduce you to the course, what we will do, what economics is, and such. Then we will pause a moment to understand what economics as a field of social sciences is. And then we will ask question, why should we study economics? So why is it important? And after trying to come up with some answers to this interesting question, then we will have a discussion on the scope of economics. So what kind of topics do we cover? How do we categorize our studies? And what fields of economics you can encounter. And then, as the last section of this first lecture, we will also see, we will have an introduction to the method of economics. So we will cover some concepts, some notions that we will be using during this lecture. So before covering the syllabus, let me introduce myself. So I'm Osman Küçükşen. I'm a research assistant at Department of Economics. So you can reach me at any time at my email account that appears on your screen. And for some reason, if you really want to see me, you will find my office at the Department of Economics at Faculty of Economic and Administrative Sciences. So it's going to be on the second floor in room 51. So currently, due to this pandemic, so there will be no office hours, but we can arrange online or in-person appointments via email. And before I cover my slides, I need to make a disclaimer that so I base my slides on the lecture slides that were provided by Pearson for the textbook that I'm going to cover, which is Principles of Economics by Case, Fair, and Oster. So, what we'll be doing in this lecture? So, in this lecture, we will give an introduction, as the name suggests, to economic thinking and some economic methods that are widely used in the field of economics and the tools that are required to apply these methods. So we will also give some brief explanations about different kinds of economic problems that we will be dealing with and the related concepts that help us to understand the nature of these problems. So in order to elaborate on these topics, we will give some examples of different kinds of economic choices and decisions that we will be trying to understand and solve eventually. So let's have a look at our syllabus. So again, these are information about me and how you can contact me. And I strongly recommend you to have a look at the website that I prepared for this lecture. So there should be a mistake about the sections. So I think electrical and electronics engineering must be 02 instead of 03. I am planning to have Zoom meetings almost every week in order to cover the course material that I put online, including these kind of videos, so that we can have more interactive sessions where you can ask your questions, or you can also ask me to elaborate on certain topics that you feel like that you didn't understand very well. So on Tuesdays, we are going to meet with electrical and electronics engineering students from 10:15 to 12:45, and on Fridays in the morning, I will have a session for chemical engineering students, and in the afternoon, physics engineering students can also attend to these Zoom meetings. So the study materials include, most importantly, the textbook, of course. Um, and the reason is that I base my slides and also my lecture notes on this textbook. So the textbook that I have is again called Principles of Economics. I'm using 12th edition, but you can also use an earlier version of this book by Case, Fair, and Sharon Oster. So attendance to Zoom meetings, online meetings is not mandatory, so I'm not going to take any uh, attendance. But I also recommend you to attend these courses so that we can have a more interactive discussion about the topics that we cover. So uh, I'm not 100% sure about the grading that I will have, but I'm planning to have at least I have to have at least two exams. So currently I'm planning to have a midterm exam that will be the 40% of your final grade, and a final exam that will be the remaining 60% of your grade. So I'm not sure whether I'm going to make them as a take-home exam or online exams, but I will announce when I make my mind about how to make these exams. So the general rules apply so that there won't be any makeup exams unless you have a legal excuse. Um, and you're all aware of the translation of your grades into letter grade or the grade out of 4. So I'm not planning to apply any rescaling such as you know curve, so that what you take from exams will be your ultimate grade. And I strongly discourage you to attempt any kind of plagiarism, and I have trust on you on these kind of issues. So let's have a look at the content that we are going to cover throughout this course. So again, the first 2 weeks, we will have an introduction to economics in general. And so these topics will have the scope and method of economics, what is scarcity and choice, and other related topics. So the second part will be on the market system. First, we will try to understand the household behavior and how consumers make choice. And second, we will have a discussion on how firms behave or how firms make their economic choices, which will be related to costs they encounter, and we are going to divide these costs into short run and long run costs. Then, of course, in order to produce, they need some input like labor or capital and such. And once we understand the firm's behavior, so that we can meet these two counterparts in a general equilibrium to understand the balance between the demand forces and supply forces. So in the second part, we will have a notion of perfectly competitive market. But then in the third part, we're going to see that markets are not always perfect. So there will be some frictions or imperfections in the market. So what kind of imperfections will be the topic of the third part? And if there is some misfunctioning markets, then we are going to argue that there will be a role for government to help agents to have a better outcome of these markets that will be related to distribution of income, and taxation will be one of the most prevalent tools that a government will be using. So this third part will be the last part for the microeconomics, introduction to microeconomics. And starting with the fourth part, we will have an introduction to macroeconomic topics. And the fifth part, we are going to elaborate on these discussions to include expenditure, output, and fiscal policy. And we will also have a look at the money markets, so how they function, what kind of discussions should we have when we consider money markets. And of course, as you probably already know, that economics is about equilibrium, so that we will try to understand what a macroeconomic equilibrium means. Then, if time allows, in the sixth part, we are going to cover some topics in economics of growth. And in the seventh part, we will have discussions on financial crisis and stabilization. What is stabilization? Why is it important? How government policies are involved in providing stabilization in the economy. And we will conclude, again, if time allows, with some topics on international trade. So, and this will be the end of our lecture. So, the structure. Um, so as so, I'm trying to keep my pace with the technological developments, so that I want to provide you with the most informative material as much as I can, so that, as you know, our infrastructure HUSAM is the first platform that I will be making my announcements and reaching you. And I again strongly encourage you to follow my website for this lecture, because I will be updating it continuously. And I will also construct a YouTube channel to put this kind of videos, so that if you cannot attend to Zoom meetings, you will always have these videos available. All right, so let's dive into some starting points. So what we will be talking about, what economics is, what do we understand from economic problems and such. So economics as a field of social sciences actually does not have a very long history. So maybe we can think of mid or late 18th century or mid 19th century as economics, then called political economy, being a separate field in social sciences. But of course, the questions about economic problems occurred way before that time. So we can track it back to ancient Greek philosophers, including Aristotle himself, asking about what determines value. So why people desire something. So why do they exchange certain things, and how should they exchange? So what should determine uh, the value of two goods, that if two parts, or suppose that two people wants to exchange an apple for an orange, so how should they decide how many apples should one give for one orange? So this kind of questions is considered as the problems of classical economy, or you can also think of them as questions that were arise by classical economists. Uh, so, in that sense, economics has a very broad explanation or very broad definition, so that anything that involves exchange of or distribution of material wealth, some sort of material wealth, is a subject for economic studies. So that when you think about it, it is almost any question that you can think of in social sciences would be can be translated into an economic question. But however, in this lecture, we will follow a less comprehensive but a more direct definition of economics. So for us, economics will be the study of how individuals and societies choose to use the scarce resources that nature and previous generations have provided. So, there are two bold expressions or concepts here. One is to choose or choice in general, and the second is care. So we first need to understand what we refer to when we use these two words or two concepts in order to have a better grasp of what economics is or what an economic problem would be. So first, let's look at to the first part of this definition, the study of how individuals and societies choose. So this is not very informative for us for now, right? So we from this definition we know that individuals and societies choose what and how and why. So we will be giving answer to these questions in this course. But in short, as you would think that these choices should be about choices over some exchange, so it should involve some exchange. So I should be giving something and taking something in return, right? So in order it to be an economic choice. But this is not enough. On top of it, so there should be some value attached to this choice. So if I choose something, so suppose that I'm supposed to choose A over B or B over A. So I have two alternatives. One is option A. Let's say, again, the simplest example, an apple versus an orange, right? So why should I choose? I mean, we can observe that some people would choose apple over orange or the other way around. So in economics, we should first understand or we have to conceptualize the fact that some people choose apple and some people choose oranges. So this can be explained by preferences in particular that some people might find apple more preferable over orange, but still this explanation is restrictive in the sense that we can see some regularities in choices, right? So in general, maybe this apple versus orange example is not a very good example, but for example, we know that people like money over, let's say, love in general. I don't know, I'm speculating. But we also in economics have to explain these regularities in order to have a better understanding about why most of the people, let's say, choose an alternative over the other. So this was only the first part of the definition, and the second part is about scarce resources. So what is scarcity, and why should we be dealing with scarcity in economics? So in order to understand this concept, so I mean the meaning of the word already explains it quite a bit, but this is an important part of economic methodology because if we don't have any scarcity in our choices, so I mean, if you could decide to live forever, let's say, so then it wouldn't be an economic problem in the first place because then you don't have to choose in the first place if you don't have any scarce resources, right? So that's why economics is a science of optimization, as you engineers would understand quite good, because of the scarcity that we face in our economic problems. By the way, before I move on to these new concepts, economics originated from economy actually has a very interesting meaning, which is very in line with this definition of economics in the first place. Um, as far as I remember it, originates from Greek words oikinos, which simply means house, and nomos, which is management. So if you combine these two words, you would have oikonomos, or economics or economy, which would simply mean housekeeping or house management. So as the economic relations, economic interactions, economic interdependence gets more and more complex throughout history, so the definition of house and management has a different meaning. So it is not even restricted to a country level, but it's in global level that now economic problems have their meanings. So the second part, so of course, I mean, you're just supposed to take an introductory course, but you're well aware of the fact that economics is a important part of our social lives as well. So then one could ask, why should we study economics? So what does it teach us? So first of all, economics is a discipline that tries to conceptualize and tries to give explanations to certain economic decisions, behaviors, interactions, economic facts, and their consequences and their influences on several aspects. So in order to do that, we need to have a understanding of these um, facts, decisions, interactions, and such. And we use certain concepts to help us understand these things. So to illustrate, I'm going to give you three examples of these kind of concepts that are very useful even in our daily lives. And one is opportunity cost or economic cost, is, we can also call, which simply means the best alternative that we give up when we make a choice. So this is very related to this scarcity concept that we have seen in the definition of, or textbook definition of economics in the first place. So maybe it's better to understand or easier to understand when you give an example about it. So again, let's go back to our apple versus orange example. So the most simple example. Suppose that there is no money and you have only two choices, and you are supposed to take one of these options, either an apple or an orange. So suppose that you choose apple, for some reason you like apple more, then, and I don't require any money for this alternative, right? So you can just take it. If you would ask a person what would be the cost of this apple, so suppose that a friend of yours seeing you eating this apple that you have taken for free, and he asks you, how much did you pay? What was the cost of this apple? So the straightforward answer that it was free, so the cost was zero. But in economic understanding or economic way of thinking, actually you had to bear a cost, which was an orange, because you could either choose an apple or an orange, and by choosing an apple, you had to give up an orange, right? So again, so this is a very abstract problem, but you can also implement this concept in almost any decision that you make in your everyday life. For example, our choices on use of time are very good examples, right? So if you're watching this video, which means that you spend your time trying to understand some introductory economic concepts, but so it's for free, I mean, except for the electricity or the internet cost that you're paying, but otherwise it's supposed to be free, right? However, there is another cost. It's only one part of the cost that you're bearing, because you could be watching, say, Netflix, for example. So once you have a grasp of opportunity cost, then when you make a choice, mostly an economic choice, you have a better understanding of what economic cost of making a choice is. So a second concept that we will be using very often is marginalism. So you will hear a lot about marginal cost, marginal utility. Uh, in simple words, it is actually the process of analyzing the incremental or additional costs or benefits resulting from a choice. So, why is it interesting and why is it important? It is interesting because when it comes to more complicated economic questions than this apple versus orange example, we actually make our choices continuously, so not one time, right? Um, so it's not like, I mean, some decisions might be either this or that, but however, most of the economic questions are like, how many of them would you like to want, or would you like to buy, or how much money you would like to spend on a certain thing, right? Or how much time do you want to spend on Netflix? Like it can be 1 hour, it can be 2 hours, it can be 3 hours. But this decision is actually continuous. Um to give a more concrete example, suppose that you go to a coffee shop and suppose that you took first coffee, so you paid, I don't know, 15 liras for that. And then you ask the question, so should I buy a second cup of coffee or not? So for the first coffee that you bought, so you had a desire for coffee, and so you thought that 15 liras was worth it. But for the second cup of coffee, although you're going to pay the same amount of money, so the same amount of marginal cost, so the benefit that it brings might be smaller. Then you most probably wouldn't go for the second cup of coffee, right? Another more general example, an interesting example, actually is uh, it's a paradox. It used to be a paradox. I don't know. So it's a paradox in economics. So why diamond worth more than water, right? So if you would compare, I mean, if you would ask you the question, so you can have either of it. Would you have water for rest of your life, or would you like diamond for rest of your life? Once you choose one, you can never have the second one, right? So the obvious answer is, of course, you would go for water, and the reason is that it's essential for your life and such, so you cannot live without it. But although water is so important for our lives, so it's basically the source of life and we cannot live without water. So why does diamond worth more than it? And the reason lies behind this idea of marginalism, that the sources for water is not quite scarce, so that we have enough water so that we can afford. But diamond is so scarce that once you compare the incremental amount of water that you would like to buy versus the incremental amount of diamond, then you can conclude that the diamond might worth more than the water. So we will elaborate on these kind of concepts in the following lectures. So another concept that might be interesting for our course is efficient markets. So which basically states that an efficient market is the one in which profit opportunities are eliminated instantaneously, like very fast. So why is it interesting? Again, to give an example of the efficient market concept. So consider you go to grocery shop. Let's say it's around 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock when it's quite busy, and you have to prepare dinner for your friends or so, and you're in a hurry, and you want to choose the shortest line, right? So what would be the shortest line? Probably most of the people in the grocery shop think the same way as you do, right? So they want to go to their homes as soon as possible so that everybody is searching for the shortest line. Then the efficient market hypothesis or efficient market concept tells that if everybody has the same information or same motivation in this grocery shop, then every line must be equal in equal length. So this efficient market concept is also called no free lunch, which is applied quite frequently or quite it's a common concept in financial market applications that if everybody has the same information, for example, about the stock market, then there shouldn't be any excess profits about participating in the stock in a particular stock. So this is the first reason why should we study economics, to have a better understanding that can even affect our daily lives or daily economic choices. So the second reason could be that economics can help us quite a bit to understand the society. So if you look at the history, so you will see that most of the changes in social structure, especially when it comes to big changes, somehow have economic roots in that or some economic aspects in these. A more recent example for these kind of changes in social structure could be the developments in World Wide Web, right? How it affected our lives. Now that I'm shooting this video and I'm putting on YouTube so that each one of you can access this. But the very reason that World Wide Web had spread it quite a bit uh, has started from economic motivation in the first place. And the main impacts that we see uh, is also quite economic. So imagine a life, a world without internet, and suppose that we were having a similar pandemic, so that we would not be able to have any teaching, and so which means that you will graduate way later, so you'd participate in labor markets later, and it would have a different influence on your social life at the same time. So uh, for economic discipline or economics, one of the most substantial changes um, in social structure that have huge economic impacts was Industrial Revolution, which started in England around late 18th and early 19th centuries. And it was a time that the production technologies has changed quite a bit. So you probably all know the story behind the Industrial Revolution. It was the invention of steam engines, so that um, which enabled mass production that you could produce in very big amounts. In return, these new manufacturing technologies and also the innovations transportation changed the way that we produce things and how it organized labor markets, and consequently it resulted in movement of a huge amount of population from countryside to the cities, so that basically after a century or two it was a whole different life, a different economic structure, different economic decisions, different economic interactions, and in return a different society at all. So understanding the economic structure or developments in economy in general can also inform us in a very big extent what's happening or what will happen in our social lives and in social structure in general as well. So this is another reason why we should study economics. And a third example is to be an informed citizen, so that in modern countries, modern societies, individuals participate in political decisions as well, right? So because any kind of action that was taken by the government, like how they implement policies or how their politics actually were shaped by different kind of economic motivations, how taxes were implemented, and what kind of governmental investments that they take has direct impacts on our daily lives as well. So that having a better information about what's happening in our economy also helps us to have better actions, better political choices um, at the same time. So, I hope that I could give a taste of how complicated economic thinking or economic problems could be, so that we can start from an apple versus orange question and uh, very quickly go up to political decisions or taxes and such, so that or global economics crisis, so that it has a very wide scope that can start from a very small, very from very bottom, from very simple questions to very complicated questions. So in that respect, um, throughout time, economics has divided into some kind of subfields that economists focus on different kind of economic problems and specialize in these fields. But the main categorization in economics, as you probably heard already, is between microeconomics versus macroeconomics. So when we speak about microeconomics, we are talking about the branch of economics that is focusing on individuals. So it could be consumers, it could be households, it could be firms, it could be industries like particular industries, and the behavior of these entities, so these decision making units. So that the microeconomic branch, so the microeconomics, focus on individual decision making, economic decision making. When we speak about macroeconomics, on the other hand, it tries to understand what the aggregate behavior or aggregate entities um, are. So how are they shaped? What are the impacts of these kind of let's say variables on a national or on an international scale from time to time? So what kind of um, aggregates are we talking about? So it could be the income of a country, for example. We speak about GDP of a country, so gross domestic product. So probably in like daily political discussions, you hear a lot about, or employment rate in a country, or total output, so total production in a country, is the subjects for macroeconomic field. So to summarize, when we speak about microeconomics, we think about a field or a subfield that focuses on trees. So then, how like each individual tree look like or how they behave and such. And macroeconomics sees and analyzes the forest as a whole. So this is the first main distinction within economics. But to elaborate on that, um when we speak about like microeconomics on the production side, so if you have a economic question about production, so microeconomics focus on production or output in certain industries or certain businesses or certain companies and such. So they ask, or microeconomics economics ask questions like how much steel were produced in steel industry. So how much office space a particular firm uses and what is the effect of this office space on the firm's production, and how many cars should a certain company should produce uh, given certain conditions. But macroeconomics, when it comes to production, is interested in national production. So what should be, for example, the the amount of total industrial output is the interest of macroeconomics. So remember that for microeconomics, it was the production of a certain industry. However, for macroeconomics, what is interesting is what would be the total industrial output. Or again, as I mentioned before, instead of income of a certain firm or profit of a certain firm, macroeconomics is interested in gross domestic product or growth of the production in a particular country. So when we speak about prices, microeconomics focuses on price of individual goods and services. So, for example, the price of apple or price of oranges is the interest of microeconomics. Or, there are different examples like price of medical care, price of gasoline, food prices, apartment rents, and such. So this is the interest of microeconomics. But for macroeconomics, most of the time, the main interest is on aggregate price level or price levels. So these prices are calculated differently because they can have different meaning for different sectors. So that we will be speaking about consumer prices or producer prices, and most importantly, as you well know, the rate of inflation is one of the most important aggregate variable that we're interested in macroeconomics. So on the income aspect, so the distribution of income and wealth on the individual level is the important subject for microeconomics, like wages in a particular industry or the effect of minimum wages on household labor supply choices or executive salaries or poverty of individuals, like uh, in certain industries, for example, would be the interest of microeconomics. On the other hand, for macroeconomics, what is important is the national income. So what is the total wage levels and salaries would be one aggregate variable that macroeconomics would be interested in, or the share of corporate profits in total income of a country would be another example for an macroeconomic variable. Again, on the employment side, microeconomics focuses on employment by individual firms or industries, or if you look from the household side, so they would be interesting for microeconomics to look at the individual labor supply decisions, like how many hours, for example, university graduates would like to supply or would like to work. For macroeconomics, on the other hand, employment rates or employment and unemployment in the economy is more important, so that what would be the total number of jobs, or what would be the unemployment rate, or what is the labor force participation rate, are kind of aggregate variables that macroeconomics would be interested in. So this micro versus macroeconomics division is the biggest division in field of economics, but there is further specialization in each part of this economic studies. So let us go through some specialization fields or subfields of economics. So behavioral economics is the field that is actually a quite interdisciplinary field that has a lot of interaction with psychological theories or socio psychological theories, And they apply these theories into economic decision-making processes, and they also make experiments on how certain psychological motives affect economic decisions of individuals. Comparative economic systems is a field um, that compares different economic systems. So the economic system that is the most prevalent in all around the world is so-called market system, so that governments do not directly intervene how markets operate, but I mean they're mostly mixed, so that government can intervene from time to time, but most of the time they let the markets operate on themselves. But like the Soviet Union example, there can be also planned economies that prices and the production um, systems are basically determined by the political institutions instead of markets. So that this comparative economic systems is the field that compares the outcomes that can come from different economic systems and evaluates the performance of these different systems. Econometrics is a subfield, but also um, accompanies many of these subfields, so that you have econometric applications in every subfield that we will see here. But in general, econometrics is a subfield that applies statistical techniques on economic data that we can observe or we can obtain in order to understand relationships between different economic forces. For example, in econometrics or using econometric techniques, you could ask, for example, how changes in inflation rate affect employment rate. So that this is an empirical question, so that we use econometrics to understand or to infer from data, what kind of forces affect each other in which ways. Economic development is the field of specialization that focuses on the problems of low-income countries. And so the questions that they arise mostly involves what are the determinants of development? So what are the best policies in order to help a less developed country uh, in terms of development? Um, and these kind of questions are mostly asked by economists that study economic development. The historical past or historical events are very important for developments in economics, because we can understand a lot from economic or from history. So that economic history involves economists that specialize in the uh, development of the modern economy. So they look at historical events and they try to analyze the consequences of these events, and in certain cases they also make some counterfactuals, like asking questions: what would happen, for example, if the Second World War didn't happen? Or what kind of lessons can we derive from the Great Depression, for example? Environmental economics is, as the name suggests, that focuses on the consequences of certain economic activities on environment, and they are more concerned about sustainable growth with a particular concern about nature. So the finance, as you well know, examines the ways in which households and firms actually pay for their purchases. So that they study capital markets including stock and bond markets, future and options, capital budgeting, and asset valuation. Um, so, although it doesn't seem like a direct concern of economics, health is actually a very big industry, and of course, there are specialized people also in health economics. So they focus on. Um, so there are, although in our country it's not very prevalent for now, but in other developed countries, for example in the US, government plays a minor role in providing healthcare, so that the private health expenditures are very important to study, and also finances or how it affects aggregate outcomes is very important to understand to evaluate economic performance of a country. On the other hand, for countries like Germany or Turkey to some extent, so it involves a big portion of government budget to finance healthcare systems, so that it is important to understand the consequences of um, some consequences of the health conditions or um how the health system is regulated can be quite important for microeconomic and macroeconomic aspects. So the history of economic thought is concerned about how the philosophy or methodology of economics has evolved over time. Um, so it starts from maybe going back to ancient Greek philosophers up until uh, contemporary economists in order to understand the roots of economic thinking and how it developed, how it evolved over time, and what kind of philosophical or ethical movements affected the way we think about economics right now. And as I said, economics can have very different meanings depending on the background that you have. So the textbook definition that I have given here actually corresponds to a particular way of understanding economics. But this discussion is beyond the scope of this lecture. So I gave a reference on my lecture notes that, if you're interested in these kind of topics, I strongly encourage you to have a look at this book that you can easily find also online. So industrial organization, again, as the name suggests, focuses on, so it's a subfield of microeconomics. So it focuses on particular industries and the firm behavior in these industries. So they ask questions like how do businesses compete? So what is the effect of lack of competition in a particular industry? Who gains? Who loses? And these kind of questions are part of industrial organization. So international economics studies the trade, international trade, and international financial interactions. Um, so there are many also subfields within international economics that looks at different aspects of international economic relations or economic interactions. But when you compare one country to another, or when you try to understand the interdependence between economic decisions of two different countries, so you are in the district of international economics. Labor economics, um, again, most of the time the name suggests, um, can have a microeconomic meaning or a macroeconomic meaning, but in general, it's concerned about the effect of different economic factors on the decisions from the labor side or the employer side, so or their combined interactions. So they ask questions like how does a change in a particular economic variable affects the behavior of a worker, or how people choose how much to work, uh, in what kind of job to work, and these kind of questions again is asked and analyzed by labor economics. So labor economics is have an increasing popularity, especially in continental Europe. Um, since the rules of the game, so the rules of the game in terms of in market institutions, for example, how to build a company or what is the scope of a company that can operate, is determined by laws, so that the legal aspects of the regulations is quite important for economic activities. So that this field asks and tries to answer questions like how does the law change the behavior of individuals and businesses? Do different liability rules make accidents and injuries more or less likely and such? So public economics is the field that investigates the role of government in the economy. So um, the government intervention can be quite important in certain cases, especially if there is some kind of market imperfections, um, or there are risks that cannot be insured against. So that these are kind of cases that the government intervention might be required, so that the public economics is the field that we raise these kind of questions. And lastly, urban and regional economics focuses on um, the spatial arrangement of economic activity, focusing on mostly on cities. So why do we have cities? Why are manufacturing firms locating farther and farther from the center of urban areas? These are all economically related questions and investigated by urban and regional economics. So the subfields of economics is not limited to these that we have covered here. Actually, there are even more specialization within these subfields, or there are also different kind of specialization fields. Um, for example, gender economics can be considered as another field, another subfield, or as I mentioned before, international trade and international finance can be considered as a, a finer division of international economics. So why do we have this many subfields, right? And the reason is the economic problems and economic interactions is everywhere. So, when you really start thinking about it, and once you understand what an economic question is, then you really understand the scope of it. And the problem is that these problems or these questions are not very easy to answer, so they're really complicated. They have, as we have covered, so they have psychological explanations, there are sociological explanations, there are legal aspects of to the economic problems, there are political aspects to the problem, so that it makes it hard to come up with a unified theory or unified argument that can solve all of these problems. But instead, economics has to be considered as a interdisciplinary field or interdisciplinary science that makes use of all other parts of all other fields of science, either they are social sciences or positive sciences, in order to have an explanation to these kind of economic problems. So Before we conclude, let's have some introduction to the method of economics. So, what is what does methodology mean? So, why do we need to understand the method of a particular field of science? So, the reason is um, the way we approach the questions or the tools that we use actually also they were developed to make enable us to answer these questions more easily. So once we understand these tools or concepts, so we will have a better understanding of what we are dealing with and how can we approach these problems. So uh, the one big separation or two big different approaches to economic questions is the positive versus normative approach. So when we talk about positive economics, we kind of mean economic problems that we can answer by looking at the facts. So that it seeks to, the positive economics seeks to understand behavior and the operation of systems. So how the system, like economic market, for example, a particular market operates without making judgments. So it tries to describe what is happening currently and how it really works. So having said that, so you should remember this definition, but I have to put a disclaimer here saying that in social sciences, it is really hard or almost impossible to come up with explanations to certain behaviors or how certain things happen without making judgments. So this is just a disclaimer and I leave it here so we can elaborate on that if you would like on our Zoom meeting. So the second division is normative economics. So this is supposed to be the opposite of the positive economics. The definition says that it's an approach to economics that analyzes outcomes of economic behavior, evaluating them as good or bad, and may prescribe courses of action. So this definition tells us that in positive economics, we don't say what is good or what is bad, so we just try to say how it is, right? Using certain set of tools. But in normative economics, in this approach, so we have an understanding of what is good or what is bad. So the reason that it's also called policy economics is that when you suppose that you're a decision maker in a government, so you have to decide either to implement policy A or policy B, right? So most of the time, when you choose policy A, probably you make a portion of population better off in expense of making other portion worse off. So you have to, for example, by implementing taxes, you take some from the richer people in order to distribute to the poor. So in that respect, when you do that, you implicitly say that having a more equal distribution is a good thing for all of us. So that it requires a judgment in the sense that equality is a good thing. So this is the main difference between positive economics and normative economics. So we also have an approach to certain economic problems, which is called descriptive economics. So a descriptive economic study is a study that uses a set of data that only pictures what is happening. So it's not after trying to explain what explains what or why a particular economic event happened because of a certain factor or certain another event, but it just says that uh, this particular event has happened. So an example of a descriptive economics would be to analyze economic crisis over time, for example. If you plot a graph, so to show that how production change over time, so this would be some kind of descriptive economics, and from time to time, it can be quite interesting and useful to have to have these kind of studies in order to understand what has happened. But again, this kind of approach is not after any kind of explanation behind what has happened. But in general, um, in economics, we try to give an explanation in certain economic events or economic actions or economic decisions. So in order to do that, as I mentioned before, economic decision-making processes, economic events, economic interactions are quite complicated and might be affected from many, many factors. So, for example, let's think about our coffee example as we mentioned before. So your demand, so the reason that you buy a coffee might be affected by many economic factors. The money that you have in your pocket, or the stress level that you had that day, or the weather of the day, whether it was cloudy or whether it was sunny, can affect your economic decisions a lot. So, uh, one, since these economic decisions or economic events are quite complicated, but since we still want to come up with some understanding of what's happening, we need to use theories in order to make um, what is happening a bit easier to understand. So in order to do that, we use set of related statements. So these could be some facts, some axioms, some assumptions about cause and effect or action and reaction. So they might mean the same thing or not the same thing, depending on the question at hand. So in order to build economic theory, or in order to explain the theory that we have in mind, we use models, which is a formal depiction of a theory. And typically we use mathematical statements of some kind of presumed relationships across certain economic factors or variables. So what's a variable that we are talking about? It's a measure that can vary, as the name suggests. So these are going to be some factors that we think that can influence or might be influenced by other economic factors. So again, so let's go back to our coffee example again. So suppose that I'm an economist who would like to understand the coffee demand behavior of a certain individual, right? So as I mentioned before, it might be affected from many, many things, but most of the time I'm interested in a more restricted set of variables that can explain each other. So for example, I want to analyze the effect of salaries on coffee demand. So if it is the case, then so how rain, for example, affects your coffee demand is not my main interest. So it does not directly influence the way I think about the relationship between salaries and the coffee demand. Hence, it is not a important variable that I would like to evaluate in my model, right, or in my theory. So that Occam's razor is a principle that we implement a lot in economics, which simply suggests that we should cut off the irrelevant details because they do not help us to understand a particular economic question, but they rather make it very complicated. And believe me on this, that economic models can get very complicated very easily. So even if you include, let's say, 3 to 4 variables to explain a certain variable, a model can get really expensive to understand, so really hard to understand, let alone trying to solve it by using mathematical methods. So that Occam's razor uh, can be dangerous if used by um, reckless hands, let's say, but it is also useful in order to isolate a specific set of factors that we would like to analyze. So another concept that we use a lot in economics is the well-known ceteris paribus, which simply means all else equal. So why is it interesting, or why is it useful? The reason is the following. So again, as I said before, in economics, we are interested in direct relationships between some economic factors. So going back to our coffee example, so I would like to understand the effect of my one's wage on her coffee demand, right? So in most of the cases, um, many variables might be affected by the same economic factor. For example, if your wage is low, then your stress level might be high. Then it might either increase your demand for coffee or decrease the amount of coffee, or vice versa. If your coffee demand is high, so if you consume a lot of caffeine, then your stress level might be too high, then it might cause a job loss for you, for example. So, what I'm trying to say here is that if we are focusing on certain relationships, we would like to understand the direct effects in most of the cases of one variable on another. So, in order to do that, we assume that only one factor changes at a time, and we try to evaluate the effect of this change in this particular factor on another factor by keeping everything else equal. So we suppose that nothing changes, but only this factor A changes, and then we would like to understand how this change in A affects B when we keep everything else same. So this is, in short, is the principle of, or the concept of ceteris paribus. So theories and models are our friends, but again, we have to be very careful when implementing some methodology to our theories or models. And two dangers that encountered most often are here. So the first is post hoc ergo propter hoc mistake. So which means after this, therefore because of this. So suppose that uh, we see some economic fact or economic event happening after a certain thing that's happening. I don't know. Uh, let's think about it. For example, every morning you observe the street in front of your house that a a certain car crosses the street and the cats jump. So one can think that the cats jump because the car crosses the street, but this is not necessarily true. There might be many other reasons why the cat jumps at the same time. So we have to be careful when we try to make causal arguments. So if you want to say that this thing happens because the other thing happened before, we have to investigate deeper, and we have to come to a common sense in order to make sure that these two things actually happen in relation to each other. A second problem with interpreting economic events or economic data is called the fallacy of decomposition. So it's some kind of erroneous belief that what is true for a part of a fact or of a phenomenon is necessarily true for the whole. So, for example, you observe a group of people and you see, um, let's say, 10 men drinking, let's say, water, for example. So you cannot directly say that the man in this group of people drinks water. So if you would zoom in, maybe you would see some kind of other determinants why this particular 10 people was drinking water, but it does not necessarily mean that all the men in this group would drink water. So this is another type of problem that we can encounter when we try to interpret the economic data or economic events that we are observing. So, economic policy or um, economic policy is a big part of economic studies. So the reason is that, as I said before, so there might be many reasons why a government could or should intervene with the way that markets work. And so there are four reasons or um, four concepts that we can evaluate the necessity or the performance of an economic policy. The first concept is called efficiency, or economics is actually it refers to allocative efficiency. So when we speak about an efficient economy or an efficient economic action, we mean that this efficient economy produces what people want at the least possible cost. So that when we speak about efficiency, as you can imagine, efficiency might mean many things. For example, in energy, it might mean a different thing. But in economics, we refer to allocative efficiency. Um, for example, suppose that um, you want to build a tent and you can use two material, which has the same quality at the end of the day. So obviously you would choose the material that costs you the less, as long as they provide the same quality that you want. So you could also build the same tent by using the more expensive material, but it wouldn't be efficient in economic terms. So equity in evaluating economic policies refers to fairness. Um, But as you can imagine, the concept of fairness can have very different meanings because it's rather an ethical judgment. So, is equality fair, or I mean, the most common question, for example, is equality fair, right? So it depends on the context. It depends on the ethical judgments of a particular society and such. So that equity is a quite speculative way of judging economic policies, which is also very problematic, or um, which is also very problematic in policy discussions within economics as well. So growth is a preferred macroeconomic outcome, which basically means an increase in the total production of an economy. Um, it is a important factor in determining the performance of a particular economic policy. So, very related concept to growth is stability, which is defined as a condition in which national output is growing steadily with low inflation and full employment of resources. So that growth can happen in many ways, so that you can have output growth by, for example, pumping money in the economy, maybe in the short run, but it doesn't necessarily bring stability. Or you can also have growth by borrowing, let's say, on international markets, but it doesn't necessarily translate into stability because if you can't use your resources efficiently or carefully, that you can have some kind of growth for a limited period of time, but this may not be sustained in the long run. That which works in the opposite direction of what we call as stability. So for this week, this is all that I would like to cover. So I hope that it has been a good introduction to economics. As I said, we are going to have discussion on these topics also on our Zoom meetings. Please write me if you have any questions or any suggestions about the lecture. Before I end the video, I also suggest some further reading. It would be quite nice to review these concepts and definitions by using my lecture notes and, most importantly, the textbook. It can also be very useful to try to come up with some economic problems. So I try to give some examples, which I will also repeat in the following lectures. So try to come up with some economic problems that you encounter in your daily life and try to implement these economic concepts that we have covered. So here I leave some examples. Um, Another suggestion is since you're engineer students, I'm pretty sure that you have a very good knowledge about how to read tables, how to interpret graphs, and how to also probably you have very good knowledge on Cartesian space. And so economics is considered as the most mathematical social science, maybe, but at least in this lecture, the most advanced mathematical technique that we are going to use is actual derivatives. So also make sure that um, you remember what a derivative is, what the slope is, and such, so that we have a better understanding about the topics that we are going to cover next week. So thank you very much, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Thanks.